who we are because we don't know what we have been and where we are at this present time. And I'm going to do some things, and I hope there's a whole lot of Christians in here. I hope there's a whole lot of brothers who are Muslim in here and sisters, as well as Hebrew Israelites, because these are not you. And it's like, wait a minute. Does this work? I thought the day would be better served and have a greater impact if the focus were placed on how African spirituality and all that entails was systematically dismantled as the world's primary conceptual construct of reality. How it was attacked, the methodologies and strategies, how the surviving remnants were convoluted into the dogma of today's three major religions, mutilated and suppressed, and the psychological consequences its destruction has had on African peoples, in fact, all other indigenous peoples of the world today. Beloved, for the sake of clarity, I'd like it to be known that I am speaking about African spirituality in a purely abstract context. The qualifying word African simply being used as a marker to define an instance in the flow of human evolutionary consciousness. I'm speaking of African spirituality as a globally recognized exercise of the higher perceptual faculties in humanity, even before the continent we now call Africa became known as Africa, Al-Kibulan, Abyssinia. So my account of the attack and the erosion of African spirituality on this planet begins approximately 2,264 years ago, circa 264 BC, in accordance with the Europeans' Gregorian time frame, with a man called Ptolemy Philadelphus, a Greek who ascended the Kemetic throne after its fall to Alexander of Macedonia, who tried to make restitution for the carnage and destruction of his predecessors by rebuilding the Kemetic libraries and schools. The reward he offered was great, anywhere between $10,000 and $30,000 at that time, per set of scrolls, the price depending on the in-depthness and thoroughness of the study submitted. Those who did not commit their philosophies or give their philosophies to the scrolls or to the manuscripts were allowed to dictate their stories to scribes, who meticulously wrote them down and logged them into the library. Many duplicates of each scroll and manuscript were also made for distribution to other libraries and schools that Ptolemy planned to build, which unfortunately never happened. All in all, Ptolemy secured before his reign, or during his reign, some 280 to 350,000 scrolls and manuscripts, constituting at that time what has to be and what was the most valuable collection of scientific and spiritual data in the known world. Ptolemy himself was said to have been a scholar of sorts, or at least he is a wannabe. But he had the same Greco-Roman delusions of grandeur, where he wanted to be declared a god. So he read many of the translated works in his library, and he discovered to his amazement that virtually all, of the many and diverse systems related to philosophy, religious practice, and the sacred sciences were literally based on one and the same conceptual principle. The evidence in the library showed without a doubt that all of the ancient sciences, religions, and philosophical writings were based on but one grand, and for our purposes here, African cosmological unity, which in itself had a legacy that pointed to a time even before most ancient, more African, more, let me just say, there is no place in the past that you could dig in that you will find your origin. Because you don't have an origin. You always was, always will be. And the problem is that every time we dig up and find Lucy, we're only finding a point in the reference of evolutionary consciousness. And that's where I'm going today. When we trace the evolutionary history of African spirituality to the time of its origins, we find documentation that reveals there was never a time that man was not. Let me say that again. There was never a time when man was not. that long before there was an Africa, an Al-Kibulan, in a time when the continental masses of earth were once joined into one great land mass, called in several ancient texts Pangaea and Mu, ancient stone tablets, scrolls, and manuscripts hidden within the underground vaults of the Vatican and in the vaults of major European and Arab-controlled museums say that the earth was once inhabited but by one people, us, from one source, Sirius Mu, whose remnants can be found in the floors of the Atlantic Ocean, under the ice of the Antarctic and the North Pole, in the waters off Cuba, in the waters off the Gulf of Mexico, and in central China, as well as off the coasts of Japan. All of the above being remnants of a great global catastrophe, and that the survivors of this cataclysm were the indigenous peoples who today call themselves the Twi, the Bantu, the Yanomamo, the aboriginals of the so-called Americas, or Mexim, off of the Fiji Islands, Papua New Guinea, and the Australian continent. The libraries of Alexandria showed that all the ancient religious philosophies were based entirely on the astrosophic principles of the grand cosmic cycles of unity. That all so-called races and nations of the earth, from the original blue-black, purple-black, to the brown-black, and yes, even the green-black melanated peoples, worship cosmic deity under one grand harmonious system. And here's a note. Akhenaten was not the first to postulatize to the notion of oneness of the Creator. He simply resurrected an ancient concept older than Kemet itself. Ptolemy unknowingly gathered together this evidence of the one original system of cosmic unity into one of the greatest centralized repositories of religious, spiritual, scientific, and metaphysical information known at that time. All the evidence showed that this grand unity of spiritual, theological, science, and worship prevailed in principle throughout ancient earth. That is, until the 4th century A.D. Beloved brothers and sisters, mark this time very carefully and pay the closest attention, because it was in this century that what we now refer to as African spirituality came under the most relentless, brutal, and debilitating attack. The war against the arcane sciences of our ancient Afro-Kemetic masters, or better yet, the war against evolutionary consciousness, began under the organized leadership of a man named Constantine the so-called Great. Constantine, the founder and first Pope Caesar of what became known as the Roman State Church of Christ and Christianity. Many historians claim that the first popes of Catholicism were black, and rightly so. But these men were royal appointees, rewarded for their part in making Constantine Caesar, like Pope Sylvester, who at that time was nothing more than a bishop of the Christosites in Rome. Now, believe it or not, beloved, black people today in the main haven't the vaguest clue, not one single clue in their present state of socialized consciousness, just what this Roman state church and its religion of bloodletting has done to the arcane archetypal essence of African spirituality worldwide, nor what its sustained influence has done and is still doing to African peoples over the last 500 years on this continent and throughout the worldwide diaspora. See, beloved, to study African spirituality in its proper context here in the contemporary world, you must first learn to recognize what it is not. The first step to enter over and understanding what African spirituality is to recognize what it is not. And we must see and study what it has become through its diverse mutations, through its theological derivations as Judaism, Islamism, New Ageism, and Christianism. Since all of these representative mutations came about as a result, a direct result of conquest, and a brutally traumatic conversion process that specifically targeted the African spiritual mindset, warping and contorting its cosmic focus away from our original scientific teachings of the abstract, unitary, astrosophic principles of cosmic law. As a result of this theological mutations and their influence taking precedence, the quintessence of African spirituality now lies comatose, buried within the ecclesiastical dogma of a theopsychotic thought complex.